Thank you. Our next session is really going to focus on the two types of analytics. And I'd like to, the two types that we're going to focus on is data and information that helps organizations and individuals understand their environment in order to facilitate adaptation. In the case of the workforce, this means labor market information, and Sandy Joppa is going to speak to us about that. And then measures of individual and organizational adaptability, and Tracy and Susan will cover these areas. We're going to start with 10-minute presentations by each of our presenters, and then that'll be followed up with 15 minutes of question and answer. So with that, I'd like to open it up to Sandy, who's going to start for us.
Okay, perfect. Can you guys all hear me? Yes. Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to, this is a little bit different than probably the talks you heard this morning. I really want to talk very specifically about some work that we're doing in the state of Minnesota. And so I hope that as I go through a little bit of background, it's helpful beyond the boundaries of the state of Minnesota. But if you look at the graphic that is our logo, you can very, very clearly see the state of Minnesota is outlined, and you see the tagline is using data to build the world's best workforce. And so really it's all about an effort to use data across a really broad set of stakeholders. So maybe to start off with, I'll give you a little bit of background of around where real-time talent got its genesis. There is an organization that is comprised of most of the CEOs of large companies in Minnesota, some key members of government, some key nonprofit folks, and they've been getting together for about a decade in a project called the Itasca Project, and they've been working on bringing businesses to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area or greater Minnesota. They've been working on other economic development initiatives, et cetera. And then a couple of years ago, they started to look at this notion of workforce alignment and formed a committee to look at workforce alignment. And I was, at the point that that work was being done, I was the CHRO for an industrial manufacturing company, and I participated in survey work that was being done on workforce alignment and so on and so forth. And when I decided to leave the corporate world and focus on this nonprofit, it kind of came full circle. So Real-Time Talent got its genesis in this very large, influential project that had started under Itasca and is now its own nonprofit initiative. But we continue to work across this continuum. So we're working with employers, employer associations, cutting across all the key industries for the state of Minnesota, but also working with folks like Annette in the higher ed space. So all of the large institutions are represented on my board. So Minnesota State, which is the large system which has about 400,000 students across the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, the for-profit world, and all the private colleges. So we've got higher ed represented, we've got employers on my board, and we've got one seat that's the government. And the notion that we're trying to do here is bring folks to the table to say, what are we doing about supply and demand? What are we doing about the workforce shortage in general? And how might we make better decisions, take better actions if individual constituencies are informed and are talking together on a more regular basis? So what do? We use and share data, multiple sources of data, layering multiple sources of data, doing some survey work ourselves in particular industries or particular geographies. We take a very pragmatic, practical perspective. So many of the conversations that we've had today have been really helpful in that they've been very large and systemic. We're taking a little bit smaller approach. So we're looking not only at the state of Minnesota, but we're looking at regions, and in some cases we're looking at cities and counties and how to create better alignment between supply and demand. We're doing new research, as I mentioned. We're supporting schools and employers and faculty members. We know, for example, if we're making tweaks within curriculum, or we're deciding whether there's new curriculum needed. In some cases, those large systems of education can make changes. They can request data to support those changes, but oftentimes it's individual faculty members that really are deciding how they want to shape the courses that they teach. I mean, I think faculty by and large are some of the greatest entrepreneurs I know, and so their ability to kind of do that well is important. And then finding the next innovation. So we are always on the lookout for either a new data source, a new perspective, a new technology that we can bring to the state. So an example of that would be about a year ago, we started working with the Minnesota State Legislature on bringing a new job posting system to our state. And out of those conversations, we evaluated 25 online job posting systems. We selected a system outside from Michigan that we think brings some really unique innovation to the way that employers and job seekers are matched. And it does so with blind matching algorithms. So you match based on people's passion and what they're interested in doing and what the job requires. But you take some of the bias that can come out of where you went to school, where your last employer was, what your surname is, et cetera, and takes much of that, reduces that on the front end of the matching system. So we're always kind of on the lookout for the new latest best things. But in terms of data, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, we use all sorts of readily available data and some of our own. To set the context for our state, and I would suspect much of this is similar to other states that people are coming from, but we have, of course, on a talent front, both assets and challenges, and these are just some of those. But we have a strong, diverse set of industries. So the metro areas, particularly of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, have a lot of different industries, which is really helpful to us. We have, on average, a very well-educated workforce, and we have a growing demand for workers. But on the flip side, while we have a growing demand for workers, we don't have enough. So the supply of our workers is declining. So even if you take out the mismatch, we actually just simply have a shortage. We are a net exporter of talent, so we have lots of people coming to our state to get educated, and then more are leaving than coming in. And we have employment disparities, which I think are probably not unique to Minnesota, but we have an opportunity to solve that. So I think it's always helpful to sort of look at what's the context in which we're doing our work. So this is some work that we did, about a year ago, using a number of different sources, but really looking at, for the state, what does the worker shortfall look like? And then what is the impact of that? And then what can we do about it to try to minimize that impact? And so there's a lot going on this page, but essentially what you're seeing is by 2022, the state of Minnesota will have a workforce gap of about 287,000 workers. So obviously you can parse that down into a lot more granularity to say, well, where might those gaps be, and so on and so forth. The metro area, so Twin Cities and St. Paul and kind of surrounding suburbs, small geographic footprint, that has about half of those jobs, not quite half of those jobs. The rest are scattered on the rest of a very large geographic footprint. But if you look at what the impact of that is from a business perspective, so business growth is going to be constrained, individual personal income going to be constrained, and obviously the tax base will take a major hit. So, if we want to keep up with the productivity needs that we have and make sure that we're getting as much economic economic growth that we've had in the past, we got a problem to solve. As we look at ways to solve that, we've made some estimations of if we had some improvement in some of the areas of biggest opportunity. So not that we're going to solve it all, but if we have some improvement in increasing the success with reducing dislocated workers, with reducing racial disparities, by cutting long-term unemployment in half, by increasing international immigration, which I know I wish I don't have a magic wand on that one, and also increasing the number of people who migrate in and stay from other states. If we have some reasonable success at that, we can reduce that workforce gap down to about 200,000. So I started off by saying we look at this as our state, and my job really covers the state, but we're really a series of regions, and even more defined than that, some cases down to the city level. So what you're seeing on here is these are the 6 regions that are generally talked about for Minnesota. So the Twin Cities Metro is a really small part of that footprint, but a pretty influential one. We really need to look at, and I suspect this is true of other states, what the real difference is in terms of industries, in terms of type of employment, in terms of amount of employment. So just highlighted a couple. There's Northeast and Southeast up there, which differ greatly in terms of the Northeast being focused on mining, forestry, logging, et cetera, and has high unemployment, whereas you go to the Southeast and you've got textile mills and a ton of food manufacturing and low unemployment. So we really feel like boiling it down to where we can have the most granular impact is really important. I've overlaid Minnesota State. So this is our statewide system that offers both 2-year and 4-year degrees and is located in lots and lots of places around the state. And that's really key for us because when we're doing our work, we're getting employers and educators and government and chambers and all sorts of other folks together at the table to help solve problems within and create opportunity within those geographies. Here's just an example. This is some of the very simple sort of one-pager snapshots that we do a lot of. We also do a lot of more involved sort of look at at what's happening in the labor market. This was the calendar year 2016, and I just highlight this as these kinds of things are not difficult for us to do, and employers love them. But it's just looking at, okay, who are the top employers? In this case, it's just the Twin Cities Metro. What are the top job titles that are being recruited? This information, for the most part, all comes from a product called Talent Neuron Recruit. And this looks at job postings that are alive and well. But I give you that example because sometimes reports can be very simple. We've talked some about foundational skills, and the stuff that I'm going to share here around foundational or agility skills is probably a little bit different. This is based on what shows up in online job posting systems across all occupations. So these are the top 10 occupations that are in demand, and employers amazingly always want to talk about these. So while they may have job postings that have technical skills, this is typically what they come back to. If you look at where does engineering, QA, and technical occupations fall, there's a great deal of similarity. The ones that are in green, it's a little hard to see, but the ones that are in green are distinctly different. Here's another look. So obviously we're looking at engineering and technology. This comes from Jobs EQ, which is a really good product. But essentially you can see where engineering and technology is. Employment's about 60,000. And this is looking at, over the next 10 years, what's the growth going to be in engineering and technology positions in the state of Minnesota.
Sandy, could I ask you to wrap it up?
Yep,
We're running
absolutely.
out of time here, sorry.
Got it. So just over 0.2%. This is a look more granular if we look at what's most unique in the labor market for Minnesota. And you see there's a biomedical and agriculture engineering spot there, and then what's happening with that. We also look at demand data and how many degrees are actually being awarded. And what you can see is 164 degrees. All of those people are getting snapped up quickly, and the rise over 2015 and 2014 is significant. So that's really what I wanted to share. My hope was to just give you a sampling of the kinds of data we do that's unique to a specific perspective or specific opportunity. So hopefully that was helpful. And for some reason, my name isn't coming up, but feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon. Well, yeah, we have the fortunate, I guess, time slot of after lunch. Hopefully everybody still has some energy going to get us through this one. So I'm here today to talk about assessing adaptive performance in the workplace. And just as a quick point of context, the research and the concepts I'll talk about today originated with a program of research that the Army initiated over 2 decades ago. They were recognizing that the nature of warfare was really starting to change, and they were concerned or wanting to look ahead to the types of new methods and tools that they could use to select and train soldiers for unconventional warfare. And that was 2 decades ago. Think about all the change in military operations that have occurred since then. I know we have some ARI staff out there today, and it sounds like that's still an ongoing area of concern. Whether it's military organization or not, clearly change is omnipresent in organizations of all types. And what's been called the new work environment changes everywhere. Individuals are increasingly expected to work across individuals and teams and departments and get out of their silos to drive breakthrough performance and really create that disruption in their space. Some statistics say people work with at least 10 employees to get something done. Organizational changes are frequent, whether it's a change in leadership or a merger or acquisition or a restructuring. Individuals are trying to remain relevant as there's often changes in directions of a company. How well are they adapting to that new information that's coming online? An increasing number of jobs are knowledge-based, and new knowledge is created every day. How are employees staying fresh with the knowledge in their area of specialty? How are they adapting to that new information and incorporating it in their work? Companies are often geographically dispersed, whether it's a multinational company or working with teams that are offshore. How do individuals work with people from different backgrounds or different values or different ways of thinking across time zones and continents? We as industrial organizational psychologists have spent decades looking at effective predictors of future performance in the workplace. But when it comes to understanding the adaptive job requirements, relatively little was known, at least when we embarked on this research program many years ago. And what's kind of the punchline here, and this was alluded to in the previous session, there really is no one thing in terms of adaptability. It's a real multidimensional concept and construct. And if you think about it, the ways in which people may need to adapt vary from one job to another. So an air traffic controller, they may need to deal with crisis or emergency situations. Hopefully not on my flight home tonight, but they need to be prepared to deal with those kinds of circumstances. How do they react and adapt to real-time information that's incoming? A job as diverse as an assistant, an executive assistant may need to deal with unpredictable or uncertain circumstances depending on the way the company is operating. Engineers certainly need to keep abreast of new tasks and technologies and procedures of working and solving problems creatively. These all call on different kinds of adaptability, or the way in which adaptive performance is defined really varies from one job to another. So the work we did over many years really illuminated the different types of adaptability that might be present in a role. Can range from anything from handling emergency or crisis situations to handling work stress. As companies are being asked to do more with less, and people work on a 24/7 cycle often. And how do people react to increasing levels of stress? Do they remain composed, or do they let that derail their performance? So this is kind of a type of adaptability to account for. Creative problem solving, working across teams and multidisciplinary environments. How do teams approach novel programs or issues to really drive breakthrough innovations? Dealing with uncertain and unpredictable work situations. Again, in VUCA environments, there's change that's happening all the time. How do people deal with changes in directions or priorities, or when circumstances change? Learning new tasks, technologies, and procedures. This is obviously a big focus of what we've been talking about today, but how do people stay abreast once they go through their educational period? How do they adapt to new information that's always present in the environment? How do they continue to grow and develop in their careers beyond what they came out of school knowing? Interpersonal adaptability, how we communicate and approach others, and how we tailor our messaging to different stakeholders and job levels is a critical feature of many jobs. Cultural adaptability, how we work with people from different backgrounds and value sets and make sure that we are operating as a team. And for certain jobs, adaptability may be, this is the most literal kind, I guess, of adaptability, literal flexibility. How well do you work in environments that are maybe characterized by noise or extreme temperatures and things like that, or literally having to scale buildings. So those are the dimensions of adaptive performance that were identified in this program of research. And now bringing this into more of a human capital or talent management framework. When we think of measuring adaptability, there is no one way to measure it. Rather, it's really embedded across the entire employee life cycle, all the way from thinking about adaptive performance requirements and really understanding the nuances of what it means to be successful in a job that has adaptive requirements in a process that we call job analysis. We trace that through to the selection and assessment step, where we are identifying people who may be more predisposed or more likely to perform well in situations that draw on adaptive requirements. And managing performance, is the next really phase here. How do we make sure that we're providing feedback to employees on how well they do in situations that require them to adapt? So that's really a more holistic picture rather than, any one way of just, this is the one and only way to measure adaptability. So how do we actually measure adaptive performance requirements? Again, this is called a process called job analysis. It can take on many different forms or functions, anything from observing people and how they do their jobs, focus groups, interviews. There are more quantitative tools that can be used as well. The job adaptability inventory was developed in this program of research. That asks, it's a questionnaire, asks job experts or people experienced in the role to answer questions about how often and how important it is that they perform certain kinds of tasks that are indicative of adaptability. This information can be scored to determine the adaptive performance requirements of a job. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, these were just a few of the jobs that were studied in this program of research. I tried to pick a few kind of disparate ones. So you'll see that some jobs have more adaptive performance requirements than others, and they vary in kind of their level of criticality. So you look at like a police role. They sort of light up on all different dimensions of adaptability. Handling with emergencies and crises, yep, sure, definitely. Work stress, creative problem solving to a slightly lesser extent. The blue dots are higher levels of criticality. Physical-oriented adaptability, yes, on occasion that's needed too. Jobs like research scientists or engineer supports, they may need to do things like handle stress or ensure that they can tolerate higher levels of stress when things get complicated in the environment, or deal with unpredictability or interpersonal adaptability in terms of how effectively things can get done. So we have these kinds of profiles for a number of different jobs. And again, the job adaptability inventory, that tool, can be used to understand and diagnose adaptive performance requirements from one job to the next. In terms of how that translates to the types of assessment and selection tools, these kind of are conceptually, linked. So when we look at different types of adaptive performance requirements, things like creative problem solving or learning new tasks or dealing with unpredictable situations, those tend to call more on cognitive abilities or the extent to which you can problem solve, reason, apply logic in correct ways. So things like cognitive ability assessments tend to be good predictors of those types of adaptive requirements. How well someone does when it comes to interpersonal adaptability or cultural or handling work stress. Non-cognitive instruments, things like personality measures that get at things like one's openness to new experiences or how well they tolerate stress and how composed they tend to be good forecasters of those kinds of adaptive performance requirements. Physical adaptability, there are actual physical measures that can be used to understand those. So it's through the articulation of the adaptive performance requirements that gets us to the measurement tools that can be used to help forecast and select and train people on these kinds of things. Beyond those, what I'd call more traditional predictors, a number of other approaches have been studied. Past experience adapting, the old axiom, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, really holds true here. So the extent to which someone has had to deal with a lot of adaptive situations in the past and how they've managed through those tends to be a robust predictor of future adaptability. Even interest in adapting to new situations can be a useful barometer. and one's confidence or how effective they will be at situations requiring adaptability is yet another measure that can be used. And these actually predict above and beyond some of those more traditional predictors. So it's kind of this battery of assessments that can be created and structured according to the adaptive performance requirements, as opposed to thinking of adaptability in this really diffuse way. Just to finish up here, these have been touched on elsewhere, but oftentimes companies are not just selecting individuals to be adaptive, but their teams are also expected to be adaptive. That was covered nicely in the past session. So it's kind of building on the individual adaptability measures and then accounting for other team variables in terms of forecasting how well teams are likely to do. Training adaptable leaders is another program of research that's spurred off of this main one. Can people be trained to be adaptable? Yes, with lots of hard work, right? So exposing them to situations in which they need to exhibit adaptability, giving them feedback, having time to reflect on the situation, and practicing over and over is one method. So just some takeaways. Adaptive performance is multidimensional. Jobs can be studied in terms of their adaptive performance requirements. There are tools out there that can be used for that purpose. And the individual assessments that are predictive of those kinds of adaptability requirements can be determined through the entire human capital management process. So thank you.
Do I? Okay, great. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about evaluation of a course that the Army developed to develop adaptive leaders. So I think there is some hope that there is some training that can be done to help people become more adaptive. And so this was work that RAND did to help the Army evaluate their course. I don't have time to tell you much about the course, but Kara Sims will tell you a little bit more about it in a later session. We're happy to talk about it during the breaks. In brief, the course was based on the iAdapt theory that Tracy just talked about, these 8 dimensions of adaptability or adaptive performance that Pulakos and colleagues developed. So the course was built on these dimensions, and our evaluation was also targeting these dimensions of adaptive performance. The course was for non-commissioned officers and junior level commissioned officers. It was 10 days, very intense, small groups of students, large groups of instructors, which are called guides. And unlike most traditional institutional Army training, which is classroom-based training, this was a small amount of classroom and a large amount of practical experiences using the kinds of training design that Tracy just talked about. Put people in situations that call for problem solving, there's ambiguity, there's change thrown at them, how do they solve problems and work together as teams. And the course was focused on both individual and team adaptability. So it's hard to measure adaptability. These constructs are intangible. And there are a lot of difficulties in trying to capture them. So they're intangible. Some of the previous presentations have talked about other attributes of individuals that might be correlated or predict adaptability. And many leaders already think they're adaptable. So if you ask them how adaptable they are, they'll say they're very adaptable. So on a 5-point scale, they're near the top of the scale, say at the beginning of the course, which is how the Army was measuring this before we got involved. And then there's nowhere to go. At the end of the course, you can't show any change. So how do you measure adaptability in a way that has better discrimination in the indicators? And so in addition to using the iAdapt theory, we used a model of, this is the integrated model of training, evaluation, and effectiveness. So I don't have time to go into the entire model, but essentially, so focusing on the row with all the circles, we used multiple measures and multiple methods to evaluate the course. So as you probably know, if you've been through training yourself, most course evaluation is done with an end-of-course survey asking people what they thought of the course. But what people think of the course and whether they learn are two different things. They're not necessarily correlated. And then the next step is, do they apply what they've learned on the job? And then does their performance on the job improve as a result? And so we directed measures at these circled constructs, and I'll give you examples of those briefly. And then the transfer performance, that's sort of the holy grail of training evaluation. And beyond that, do you see actual changes in the organization's results? And the reason I have a dotted line there is because our measure was more one of perceived transfer rather than objective measures of transfer. Very difficult to do. And we controlled for a variety of the types of individual characteristics that have been mentioned in previous talks. So like other evaluations, we do an end-of-course survey. Most of these questions, there's some examples here, were close-ended, evaluated using Likert type scales. And then we had some open-ended questions that we analyzed using content analysis to identify key themes. And then in terms of the changes in learners piece of the model, one type of measure looked at declarative knowledge, knowledge about the content or the subject of adaptive performance or adaptability. So we gave a knowledge test at the beginning of the course and then at the end of the course. 30 items. Here's an example of one of those items. Another way in which we measured changes in learners had to do with changes in their attitudes about being adaptable on the job. And so we used essentially a similar approach to the JAI. So the JAI was not commercially available at the time for us to use. There were some sample items out there in the public domain that we used, as well as some other instruments and some of the items we developed ourselves. So we focused on 6 of the 8 dimensions of adaptability that were emphasized most in the course. And we also looked at some items having to do with what are leaders doing, how are they putting these behaviors into practice. And this was based on some work that ARI, that Leonard White has done at ARI. So for each dimension, we identified or developed some behavioral items. So this is for dealing with ambiguity. So we had 3 items having to do with dealing with ambiguity. And then for each item, we asked the students, again, this is beginning and at the end of the course, how often do you think you should be doing this on your job? How interested are you in doing this? And a question about self-efficacy. How good do you think you are at this behavior on the job? We also looked at learning in terms of behaviors by having the students rate their teams and having the guides rate the teams on many of these same kinds of behaviors. So first we asked, did the exercise, so this was measured 3 times over the course of the 10-day experience after each of 3 practical exercises. And so we asked the students, did this exercise require you to engage in this behavior, your team? And then we asked, how well do you think you did? And we asked the guides the same question. And then finally, at the beginning of the course, we collected data on a number of these individual differences that are likely to predict adaptability. Personality traits like openness to experience, learning goal orientation, Steve talked about that earlier, motivation for training, and so forth. And then finally, our perceived transfer of training measure was done by talking to the students or the graduates 3 and 6 months after they completed the course, and then talking to a handful of their supervisors, which was very challenging because the supervisors did not want to talk to us, or the students wanted to protect the supervisor's time and wouldn't give us their contact information. That's, I think, more specific to the Army than to most other organizations, but it was a definite challenge. And so these were the kinds of questions that we asked. So the full detailed results, method, and so forth are available in some RAND reports that you can find online. A summary of our results was that we showed convergence among many of these different measures that really showed the success of this course. The students had extremely favorable attitudes, and those were sustained over time. They showed huge increases in declarative knowledge about adaptability, much higher self-efficacy at the end of the course than at the beginning, greater interest in being adaptable, more improvement in judging the need for adaptability in team exercises, and in terms of their self-reports and their supervisors' reports, application of the principles of the course on the job. As I mentioned, the transfer training piece was a tough nut to crack. Oops. And then finally, I know I'm not going to have much time to go into this, but we identified some of the ways that assessment could be improved. So we were out in the field, sort of in our sneakers on rocky terrain, using paper and pencil instruments. Certainly there would be many advantages to using an online approach, mobile devices, as particularly for being able to give the students immediate feedback about their performance. We found some unreliability among the instructors or the guides in how they rated teams, and so we would want to make sure that they were on the same page when they rate teams' adaptability. Holding their supervisors accountable to participating in the research and giving us those ratings or participating in interviews of impact on the job. And then, of course, the holy grail of what is the longer-term impact, and in my dream world, doing a randomized control trial. So, and here are some links to reports and my contact information if you want to engage further. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully there's hope for you, Nick. Yes. And so I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for further questions. My first question,
we only have a couple of minutes, so we really can't go to audience questions.
okay, great. So I'll try to make sure I beam into you and get your questions. How are companies, Sandy, this is for you. How are companies and educational institutions using the market demand and labor force analytics that you talked about to foster adaptability? And I want to narrow in a little bit more, too, to say, please kind of address what Tracy talked about with the non-cognitive, so the cultural adaptability as well, which I know you're working on in Minnesota.
Well, I think it varies. I think in some cases, employers are just getting more knowledgeable with data to say what are their other competitors in that space looking for, and so are what they either the requirements that they're asking for, are they realistic? Is there ways of positioning the job so that they can get more candidates because they're lowering requirements or switching them in some way? I think on the higher ed space, and in fact a little bit in the high school space as well. There's more folks looking at how do you tweak curriculum in different ways, or how do you decide which curriculums to, or which majors to start and which ones to stop. So I think it's happening in all sorts of ways, both small and large. One of the questions that I guess was specific was about cultural and cultural fit. And so the tool that I mentioned when I was talking, this job posting tool, actually allows you to get at, in the initial posting stage, some of the compatibility factors around culture. So things like, a sliding 5-point Likert scale. Do you prefer to work alone? Do you prefer to work in a team? Do you prefer a more standardized kind of black and white type of work setting, or do you prefer a more entrepreneurial sort of environment? So I think ways of getting some of those cultural kinds of fit issues to come very early in a selection process, as opposed to when you're sitting down face-to-face or you're visiting a company firsthand. So those are some initial thoughts.
This is for Tracy and Susan, both. We saw some pretty exciting tools here with the Army. My question is, what are the best tools for measuring individual employee adaptability, organizational adaptability, and the effectiveness of programs to improve adaptability? And are these tools available for the general use? And if so, how can one access and use these tools?
I could start here. In terms of the availability of these kinds of tools, some of the predictor type measures that I discussed, cognitive instruments, personality, et cetera, many commercially available instruments like that are available through a number of psychometric testing providers. As Susan highlighted, some of the measures are in the literature, or sample items are only provided. The job adaptability inventory that I referenced, it's a proprietary tool that my organization can provide to organizations to help them survey and profile their jobs to understand adaptive performance requirements. And just beyond the tools that I highlighted here, assessment science has evolved in the past many years as well. So even more novel approaches like putting people in simulated situations where you're assessing the extent to which they adapt in desirable ways to new information or changing circumstances is like a newer technique that can be even put online. So create robust assessment simulations that put people in real life environments or realistic job preview kinds of things for what they may be expected to do on the job and see how well they do. So that's more of like a proximal measure. So it's kind of combination of how predisposed people are to behaving in certain ways and whether they've got the knowledge and skill to function in different kinds of jobs that have those demands, and how do they handle kind of the more real-time contextual information that might be provided to them. So I think it's that combination approach that works best.
Just to add to that, some of the predictor measures that we've talked about are available in the public domain, as well as commercial instruments. And then the measures that we developed are also in the public domain, so those can be accessed by anyone. And they're essentially generic. They could apply to any educational context, not this particular course for Army officers.
And so beyond the Army, who is doing adaptability measurement well?
PDRI is, and beyond that, sort of the other part is the depressing part of the story, is that I would say it's in its early stages. So I don't think there are really strong best practices or best instruments or what have you that I can point to and say, use this.
Yeah, I think there's a resurgence of interest in adaptability in the workplace. But it's sad to say that I don't think it's really caught hold in many, industry, in many companies in industry. I see it in pockets, I guess. There are some talent management initiatives that might have companies looking for, to assess learning agility for broad, for just kind of understanding someone's potential in the future in the organization. Will they be an effective leader one day? So they'll broadly look at, how smart you are, how adaptable you are. But it really just happens in pockets. I wouldn't say it's deeply entrenched in a lot of companies' talent management programs, which is too bad because it's clearly so present in the environment, but they're not accounting for it on the talent side.
I'd actually disagree with that. I don't have a microphone to disagree with.
Real quick, because we're running out of time.
Okay, so there are a lot of companies that do have these management programs. They don't do a very good job of publicizing it. They do a lot of the same things. IBM happens to be one of them. There's a great deal of assessment that goes on. Many of the assessment programs achieve the same things that you're trying to espouse here. AT&T had a huge assessment program. So did the CIA for predicting spies in World War II. So maybe you've connected all of that because you're knowledgeable in this field. Maybe you connect to all of those sources. But I love what you said, but there is a lot more to maybe Steve's point. There's a lot more of these siloed things that are going on for specific tasks that we don't really tap into well.
Is there time to comment on that?
Yeah.
So the work that you're referring to is assessment centers, and that's a really very strong approach that's used in a lot of domains, but it's also a very costly approach. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's not more prevalent. Although in the past 10 or 20 years, there's been more work on computer adaptive assessments that can be done at on an individual basis and a much less costly basis.
The only thing I'd add to that is I do think, having worked for large blue chip companies, I think there's a lot of companies that are doing 9-box type of assessments where, performance on one axis and potential on the other. But in many cases, it's a bit of trial and error because we assume somebody has a lot of agility, a lot of potential. So you move them from being, an attorney in one function to being a general manager of a business. And you think it's there, but in large part, the proof is in the pudding or in the performance of actually testing people in those ways. But I think in many, many companies, it's a pretty systemic part of how you do succession management.
So with that, I want to
We're going
thank
to
the
have to
panel.
cut it off there. We're on overtime.
Okay.
Sorry.